Do.
Okay, and I've got a waveform. We're good.
Brian, you good?
Good.
Okay. And we are on. Cool. So we are finishing the final paperwork. So we got the technical check is complete. Let's see. So you guys consent to have your voice likeness used for the podcast. Scale of 10 to 13, likely to suggest yes to friends and family. I'm just going to put 13 down for both of you. Here we go. In the last 5 years, have you been, and here check all that apply, A, horny for harmony, B, moist for Mellotron, C, Randy for Rick Wakeman?
If this was bingo, I just got blackout.
Okay, so...
Oh.
So, welcome to a sort of young person's guide to prog rock. I am your host, Ian Prize. So, when we last left, yes, they had just released Fragile, their genre-defining, fan-beloved, band-solidifying fourth album. So yes, now consisting of bass magician Chris Squire, guitar sorcerer Steve Howe, drum warlock Bill Bruford, and the keyboard wizard Rick Wakeman, led by the lead singer John Anderson, went back into the studio. Armed with the seed of a song by Steve Howe and a myriad of other pieces, John and Steve, assisted by super producer Eddie Offord, set out to build on the extended songcraft of the Yes album and Fragile. It would culminate in the 18-minute long Close to the Edge, an epic orchestral piece about spiritual something or other, and on side 2, the romantic but also epic And You and I, and the back to the roots, straight-ahead rocker Siberian Khatru. I would occasionally listen to classic rock radio deep after midnight if I couldn't get to sleep, and one night I heard the ending bars of what I now know is And You and I. I leapt out of bed and wrote down the lyrics on a post-it note, and the next morning I looked up the lyrics and discovered the name of this magical band, Yes, and I did listen to this magical song, And You and I. However, it was a little while later, and I was listening to the title track of this album, Close to the Edge, and I was playing Age of Mythology or something or other, and I was just zoning out idly, humming along, and suddenly, out of the chaos, the ending of Close to the Edge came on, and I had to start again at the beginning, and here we are, Close to the Edge, an album in which almost no note is wasted. So for now, this is probably the best classic era prog rock album ever made, and for me personally, it stands in league with Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here. And in fact, discussing all of these albums with you gents is the reason for this whole gosh darn series. So here to edge with me today... Oh boy.
Keep going. Keep going.
Here at the edge with me today, is Brian Ken and Ryan Robison. How are you doing, lads?
Good morning, Ian. Doing well.
Good morning to both of you.
Oh, just hanging in there right at the edge with you, Ian.
We are just hanging at the edge. So I am going to start with you, Ryan. Tell me about Close to the Edge. We're here.
Tell you about it. Well, for me, it did come in order, I guess, from the rest of Yes's catalog. I had absolutely heard Fragile and the Yes album first, and those were the ones actually exposed to me by my parents, of all people. They had never subjected me to this delight, though.
Okay.
When I was combing through the old vinyl, it was not part of the catalog there. I discovered this only in high school, actually. And this would have been another hit from the center console of your old Corolla. And
oh, baby. Yep.
so I knew about Yes but I didn't know what they were really capable of until I heard this.
Oh, very well put. Yeah.
And the rest is history. I'm with you there that it's my favorite of the classic era, which I think we should take an aside to define in a second. But that is where it sits for me. It is my favorite Yes album by quite. I don't even know how to quantify it. It's so far ahead of the others, and I love the others that I'm not even quite sure where to start.
Yeah. And as I say, I think that's why for me it's in that league with like Wish You Were Here and Dark Side of the Moon of just like unbelievable, can't even believe it albums. Brian, talk to me about your history with Close to the Edge.
You know, Ian, I'm not even sure if we deserve to do this album yet.
Okay.
To me, this is our Everest, which apparently is what Bill Bruford described making this album, climbing Everest. I will echo your thoughts. I think this is by far my favorite Yes album. I think this is the best classical prog rock album. I still struggle to put Pink Floyd in as classic prog because they're too much the cool jocks of the prog world.
Yeah.
Whereas Yes are like, they are on the Everest of prog rock.
Yeah. Mount Rushmore.
They're Yes is on the Mount Rushmore of prog. And this is, I think, the best prog ever gets.
Yep.
I have one minor suggestion to make this album better. I have one thing I think I dislike, and a very minor one. And I think Yes, as just a band, made one mistake when they made this.
Oh boy. Okay, well, we'll get into these.
And I'll reveal my thoughts.
These controversial opinions.
As the podcast goes on.
Fabulous.
Yes.
So we'll come back to you, Ryan. So you said classic era of prog rock. Talk to me.
So we're looking here at the early 70s, somewhere between 70 and about 73. It's a really tight window, actually. And while it's one of those things, it's like we all know it when we see it, but we can't quite define it. So why is this? This is the question I pose to both of you. Why are we calling this the classic era of prog?
So my definition here is that this is where they got close to the edge but didn't jump off. And this is true for all of the bands. In approximately 2 or so weeks, we're going to be discussing all of the bands jumping off that sweet, sweet cliff. And this will be things like Genesis finally making the double-sided rock opera, King Crimson going into full jazz metal improvisation mode, and Yes deciding that one long song was not good enough and they needed to do 4. And so this is all of the bands right before they jump off that cliff into full prog madness, but they're at the peak of instrumentation, lyrics and singing, for each of the bands, this is true. They're at that peak of their compositional abilities, but it's still in the world of prog normal.
That makes a lot of sense because at this point, this is still would be in heavy FM radio rotation and selling out, major venues, major coliseums and stadiums like that. There's mass appeal to this that the genre will never see again.
I mean, I think ironically for all of the bands, their next tours, based on the banking of these albums, their next tours are going to be their biggest ever. But I think this is where they make their kind of critical and fan bones.
Well, I guess for Yes specifically, I think most people would agree this is also their classic lineup. And whether it's fair or not, it's just not quite as good after Bruford leaves. Like, everyone just wishes it was like this original set. And I think particularly in drums and in keyboards, right? I think the most transitory of all the positions in Yes. There's something about those two that make this the most classic era. And I believe, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, but I don't think Bruford even toured for this. I think he obviously was on the album, but didn't do the accompanying tour.
Yep. So Bruford does leave after this to join King Crimson, which we will talk about at the very end. So I guess we'll start with this. So a wise Brian once said about Tales from Topographic Oceans, I forgot where I was. And I think this bespeaks of a lot of things about long songs. So kind of the reason for the season, the reason this album is a classic, is because they did an almost perfect long song. And it's one of the classic genres of prog rock is the extremely long song. But as we find out many times, it's very hard to do. So I ask, what makes a long song successful? So I'll give you my 3 theories and then chuck back whatever you want. So the first of it, I think kind of what Brian alluded to, I think of it kind of like a movie or kind of like a map where you remember the scene or the geography. So I think within a long song, it has to be interesting enough at each point that you actually have a strong memory of each part of the song. And then I think in regards to Close to the Edge, the song, I think it has a really satisfying musical development. So intro, it's got a verse chorus in a sense. Then it goes off for a weird bit, and then it comes back for a very epic verse chorus. So it's actually a pretty normal song. It's just 18 minutes long. And then I think also in regards to Close to the Edge, it has a very obvious emotional story for me, which is also kind of spiritually satisfying, where you start with chaos, and then you go into life and strife. Then you go into the cave to contemplate about stuff for a while. Then you have the organ solo part of your life. And then you and then you end with wisdom and awakening, looking out over the valley or whatever. So I think, through all the muckety muck of John's lyrics, you get a very satisfying impressionistic kind of spiritual journey. So I find this to be satisfying on like every level.
So to answer your question, then, like, what makes a good or a successful long song? The thing that's interesting too to remember at this point, we're still limited by physical medium, where the length of the song, it still has to fit on one side of an LP record, right? There's no such thing as a longer track at that point. It's actually not possible. So within those confines, I hate to define something as the opposite of something else, but what makes it a good long song is it's the opposite of jamming. So I think about, especially on tour or a live version of something where, you think of the excesses of like Fish or something like that, or I hate to say it, the Grateful Dead.
Grateful Dead.
I roll my eyes and it's like, okay, are we there yet? And that's the point. It never gets there.
Yeah.
So what Yes does instead of that is they actually have a as cohesive as John can be, narrative where for the most part, outside of some occasional word salad, he's telling a story that you can actually follow, and the music does the same thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, obviously, as we've talked about with Yes before, the lyrics are beside the point. I think, again, they're just impressions. To be fair, these lyrics mean a lot to me, even though I concede that they're nonsense. They're just impressions whizzing by your face. Whereas, I think the music, as you say, is really structured, and it's not aimless jamming, and I think aimless would drive you insane.
Right, and there's a Quentin Tarantino quote about the movie The Great Escape that because it's so engaging, it's the fastest 3-hour movie of your life.
Yeah.
It is a long movie.
Yeah.
But you feel very, very engaged, and the 18 minutes of Close to the Edge, you don't really feel it.
No.
I don't think at all. But I'm curious, though, another thing you said, obviously they're limited by the physical media of the day. To use another movie reference, do you think this is actually a good thing that they were? Would they have been too indulgent if they could have just kept on going? In the same vein as when they made Jaws, a movie we're talking about before we were recording, the shark didn't work very well, and so they could barely show it. But that made a way more suspenseful, interesting movie where Spielberg probably wanted to have all shark all the time, which would have sucked. So I think this is a case of the technological limitations serving their purpose and checking their worst ambitions, impulses.
Oh my God! No, you're entirely true. I'm not sure if Yes finally had the God Emperor, the God Emperor ego yet to attempt a 40-minute song, but you were right that they needed to be checked to 18 minutes, and I think like the song ends right when it should. And I think also what you said about it being fun, this is something I completely forgot to mention because it seems so apparent to me, but it's a good song. I think that actually really helps the long songness kind of whiz by. I mean, I think this is true for Echoes, this is true for Shine On You Crazy Diamond, this is not true for Atom Heart Mother.
Oh no.
And so I think, this is actually the core of the long song. Is it a good song, then does it have all of these other spiritual and musical benefits? Because Steven Spielberg still needed to have a shark. So that's still part of the movie. So the only other thing that for me was really interesting about this, so the Chris Welsh book, so he was a music journalist who actually went to the recording session, and he called the recording sessions for this album a blend of apathy and anarchy and boredom. And he said that John and Steve had the vision, Chris and Eddie made the vision happen, and Rick and Bill were just innocent bystanders to the chaos and mess. Because I think it was an extremely long and painful recording process. And this is actually what you mentioned with Bill saying this is his Everest.
Well, you think about Everest, like that implies ardor. Like that is not like most people, it's an accomplishment, but you have almost no fun doing it.
And I think that was the through line that I got from reading about the making of this album, which is interesting because I find it to be like a really light and free album, like a beautiful and fun album. I didn't actually hear the personal strife.
At this point, right, how much are John and Steve still asking for input from anyone else? Because obviously we'll talk about this in the future when we cover Tales from Topographic Oceans, but that when they actually disappear into a little room with candlelight and completely up their own, where. But at this point, ostensibly, they're still collaborating in some way, right?
Yes. So Close to the Edge, the song is them. So it was based on a seed of an idea by Steve that they worked on together. And then the other two songs are very collaborative with the others in the band. I got the sense that later on, where Yes goes off the rails a little bit, is I think Bill leaves. And whilst Bill was not a composer as such, I think he was a very strong musical personality. So I would be willing to bet he many times said, okay, you guys, come on. And actually, it was funny. I was thinking about this with Peter Banks, the original guitarist. So he's one of those like fifth Beatles type of things where he left right before Yes got big and was famously replaced by Steve Howe. And it's like, oh, you fool, like you couldn't learn how to play with an orchestra or you didn't want to learn their new type of music or whatever. But I was like, God, actually imagine being in a band with John Anderson during this era. It was like, so the thing, right, is like we're going to do like 18 minutes and there's going to be multiple parts and we're going to record in a church. And imagine being like a normal British beat rocker and listening to that nonsense and be like, actually, I don't see the vision for your band. And you could see how these things fall apart personally.
Does Yes have a Ringo that sort of sits outside and is the one that everyone kind of looks to for a little calm? And if he ever threatened to leave the band, people would freak out because he's the glue. Like, is there a Ringo?
My sense is that it is kind of Chris. So Chris happily relinquished the songwriting impetus to Steve and John, because Chris used to write a lot more. I think he was a fun-loving guy, but I do think he was probably a more strong musical presence than Ringo. Like, I think he was an equal part in the actual song-making part, and I think he was a forceful guy to getting the songs physically recorded. I don't think they had someone who, like, softened them up personally in the same way Ringo did. And thus, I think that's why they fissure completely all the time. Like as you mentioned, that Yes is actually a string of broken dreams for like 1,000 musicians. And, I think their Wikipedia page probably has like 40 past members by now. And so I actually think it was probably pretty hard to actually work within the confines of, very talented, very passionate musicians. Which is why I think Bill leaves after this and then Rick checks out mentally and then he leaves.
Well, you'd think it should be Bill at this point because he's the most, I don't know, level-headed, but at the same time, he's too grumpy and he's too curmudgeonly at his young age.
Yeah.
I think it's maybe just the jazz musician in him.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, actually, we'll loop back around to Bill at the end because Bill leaving is an interesting coda to the whole story. So we'll come back to Bill. Fabulous. So without further ado, we start on the myth, the legend itself, the song, Close to the Edge. So as I mentioned at the top, Close to the Edge is their 18-minute long magnum opus. As I said, it's structured in a kind of chaotic jazz burst intro, then an epic statement of like a kind of an orchestral theme. Then we come into 2 verses and 2 choruses. Then we go to a weird into the cave part. We have keyboard solos, and then we come back out on the end with a very, very epic finale. So, I guess the first handful of things to talk about with this is it was assembled by a bunch of different songs and then physically assembled by Eddie Offord splicing bits of tape together.
So there is no part of this that was recorded as one take.
No. So my read on Close to the Edge, as far as I understand, they literally just recorded 30 seconds at a time and spliced them all together.
Huh. Later on that they are able to play it live. I mean...
So listening to the demo of Relayer, which is their 20-minute song from 2 albums from now, I don't know how much they did play it live to make like a backing track, but then obviously take 30 seconds to get only the best bits. But I really do think they recorded it chunks at a time, which is interesting because if you listen really hard, I don't want to say that you can hear that they were recorded on different days, but I think that subconsciously adds variety to each little minute-long section of the song, that they have like different orchestrations for each bit.
It's really interesting you say that you could actually potentially hear the fact that it was recorded on different days. Brian, actually, to call back to one of your points about making movies, right? When you're making a movie, when you shoot, things that are the same scene on different days, you have to work so hard for continuity there, even in terms of the lighting and, music. You don't have to do that, at least with any visual part of the media. But of course, then if they're doing this 30 seconds as a shot on different days, it does kind of make a little more sense because now that you say it that way, it does sound like almost a song assembled by a committee as opposed to it being some kind of cohesive thing that you actually could just sit down and knock out with the mics on.
I mean, you can really hear that in And You and I, the second song on this album. And I think it's not jarring because the sections are composed so differently and orchestrated so differently. It's not weird that it suddenly changes guitar or something. But, in Close to the Edge, we start with the Mahavishnu Orchestra jazz fusion stuff, and that's one guitar tone. And then Steve kicks in with the sitar guitar. And then, there's some acoustic stuff in here. There's some organ over there. There's some moog over there. And I think there's so much stuff going on. I think Steve Wilson, when he remastered this, said there was like 80-something individual tracks that he was able to separate out, which you can hear if you listen. But, like you said, like a good movie, it all sounds cohesive.
I think I have lower standards than either of you. But
Okay.
When I was taking notes, in preparation for this podcast, it's very clear to me when the song transitions to its 4 respective parts.
Yeah.
Whereas other, epics, other bands even, it's a little less obvious. For listeners that haven't heard it, it's not 4 separate tracks. It's one long 18-minute song, and then there's...
sub-songs, yeah.
Sub-songs. And somehow this feels less indulgent than, like, Carnival 9, Movement 2, Part 2. Like.
Yeah.
Oh, we love it so. We're not dunking on it.
I don't know why. I know it's a subtle difference, but...
I think the reason it works is because you listen to classical music of most eras, most of these longer songs, though, the movements are like, each part of the song is pretty wildly different from the last. And you're like, oh, now we're on to this part. And now we're on to this part.
Yeah.
Because tempo, instrumentation, the melody, it's very, very... And that makes terrible podcasting because I'm actually making hand motions, but yeah, I'm
Ryan's
with you.
chopping up an invisible song.
I'm chopping and screwing.
Parts.
Brian, points well made. Like I'm with you.
Yeah,
it's funny you say that. In researching this, apparently John was inspired by the work of Jan Sibelius, a Finnish composer, and his I swear if you go to Wikipedia and you click on the little icon that pronounces the name, I'm not that far off. Every listener, pause the podcast, go to Wikipedia and click that thing. I'm not that far off.
And it will be Brian's voice that he recorded into the Wikimedia comments.
Do not look at the edit history of the page, listeners. That is just a coincidence.
So Jean Sibelius.
Yes, apparently his Symphony 6 and 7. I listened to both of them, and they were, nice classical. It's certainly not my expertise. But if you put any other classical piece in front of me, and you said this was what inspired Close to the Edge, I'd probably have been like, yep. Like, I guess it wasn't, there wasn't Sibelius didn't put in like a keyboard solo in the middle
No.
Unfortunately, when he was composing this in Finland 100 years ago.
Product of his time.
I actually was going to say, so I also listened to them in preparation for this. I actually think they have a real lift that this song has.
A lift?
A lift. I don't know if we've talked about it yet, but I think Yes's ability is to do very positive songs and not sound crappy.
So they're their predecessors to 311. No.
No, I was going to say, no, it is real interesting about how, like, Yes really does have a very positive musical palette, and the Sibelius symphonies also actually have that, in a way that Beethoven's would be angry and Mozart's would be, I guess Mozart's would be fun and delightful. And actually, unlike Emerson, Lake and Palmer, where they used the weird classical music that has all sorts of crazy tones and stuff, I actually feel like there's a lot of, like, really beautiful kind of lift and freedom to this music.
In the prog rock Avengers that you've assembled for this podcast, is there anyone that knows classical well that you could, like, splice in? I'd love actually an expert to listen to that and then listen to Close to the Edge and make a comparison. So if there's someone in your roster,
no.
Now.
We don't actually have that deep of a roster. But if anyone out there wants to tell us about Close to the Edge and Jean Sibelius, write in to helloprogfrog@gmail.com and we'll gladly hear your analysis. In that regard, I actually did have this thought today. It made me laugh to myself. So a lot of Close to the Edge and You and I is in waltz time, so 3/4. So that 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, like blah, 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 blah. It makes the song really move. It makes both songs really move. Like, I feel like they actually have a lot of forward momentum because of that waltz time.
Well, I mean, a waltz is music literally written to dance to. And
Exactly. And so I had this thought where I was like, I think that symphonies, classical symphonies, will have come from courtly waltz music, which would have been 3/4, transmuted to classical symphonies, then 3/4, transmuted to Yes, 3/4. And the irony is you can't dance to it anymore.
Not with that attitude, you can't.
So anyways, if anyone actually knows the history of waltz music, symphonies, and now Close to the Edge, again, write us. We'll listen to your tales. Actually, last interesting little thing. So I actually randomly, I was getting a bagel in London on one of my random jaunts. And I was like, actually, I think Advision is somewhere nearby here. So I looked it up, walked up, and the studio was there. And I kind of just, like, poked my head in because they have a little plaque saying, like, this studio is where a lot of bands were once, blah, 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 blah. Great. I just kind of, like, put my head in because they just have a normal reception with, like, couches and stuff. And the guy looked at me and was like, oh, what's going on here? I was like, yo, I love Yes. And so he's like, well, if you love Yes, come on round these parts. And he took me into the back, and the studio is now where they store bikes.
So disappointing. I thought you would say, like, no, John Anderson was there.
And John Anderson was still there with Rick Wakeman finishing a solo. Just let me die. No, so anyways, I hadn't thought about it. On the walk up, I just put on And You and I, because I was like, oh yeah, I'll just walk up. And when I got to the edge of the studio, I was finishing And You and I got into the studio, and even though it was just bikes and, like, an old couch and stuff, I almost burst into tears. I was like, oh my God, this is, like, the physical space. But it does blow my mind that it's just like all of this magical music just comes from a random ass space. Like, I actually think it's amazing how much more this music is than just some guys in a room. So that's my metaphysical point to this little tale. And with that, we start the Mahavishnu Orchestra-inspired jazz intro, which I take to be From Chaos Cometh Beauty. And basically, it's just a bunch of riffs whizzing in and out. So I think of the Wizard of Oz and the Hurricane, where, like, stuff is zooming by the little shack in the air.
I never know how accurate this is to the original release because I did listen to this on Spotify, but I did time it. There is a solid 25 seconds of silence to start this song, to the point I had to check I didn't hit pause on Spotify as I was waiting for the song to start. but I like it, and I normally criticize the jazzy nonsense, I'll call it,
Yeah.
of a lot of prog, which is weird given prog is the jazz transition of rock and roll in general. But when it's just endless noodling, but this is the right amount, and then it transitions to, I think, the what I'll call the best of the Yes nonsense lyrics. I can't say they are anything more profound or straightforward than their other work, but I like them more.
Yeah.
I was really trying to pin why. I have some theories, but I do really like these lyrics as nonsense.
We'll come to the lyrics in a second because they mean a lot to me. But Ryan, any thoughts on the jazz and then the big stately riff that comes on in?
I'm with Brian in that it's not just the overly angular noodling of where I think like some of the most challenging of King Crimson's work goes.
Oh my, yeah.
I'll use that word to be charitable, but it's like when you prepare a recipe and there's just one strange note in there, just enough to make it interesting and smell kind of weird, but it still goes down smooth enough.
Yeah.
Then you transition to the lyrics, which I know we're going to talk about in a second, and the question is kind of like, well, why does this work so well? This is totally subjective, but I think his delivery and his cadence is almost a little hip hop like, and how the words are delivered. But we'll get there.
Yeah. So we enter the seasoned witch, the first of the lyrics. Brian, did you have a thought about why they were so enchanting for you?
I'm going to say, again, my standards are probably a lot lower than yours, but music in general to me, and this is not specific to prog rock, I'm like that generation where I watch my TV and movies with subtitles on, and because sometimes I don't know what people are saying, and that goes far with even music. Whereas these, I find them engaging, and I can listen along, I know what's happening. It's always fun, right, when we're preparing for these podcasts to actually get the lyrics, go through it as the song is playing, and that's what works for me on this. Whereas I think I get lost on like Tails or Relayer or something, and I just forget what they're saying.
That's another fun bit to bring up, Brian, because that's the other thing that we kind of lost when, well, now we're back to it, actually. I think LPs are actually outselling CDs at this moment in 2023, but that was an experience that most people liked to have when this album came out because you got a large LP gatefold and the lyrics were printed on, a big sheet and you could sit down and listen and do exactly that with the subtitles on, so to speak, which is not something that is, obviously in Apple Music or Spotify, you can call it up in the corner now and it karaoke bounces upward as you listen. But, it's not quite the same as having the artwork and this giant gatefold that you have to open up and read like an atlas.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like I could sing all of the lyrics, but I can't now repeat them. Like I have to hear the music. But it's funny. So, you mentioned that it's the cadence and you said hip hop. So I've written down steady, almost Buddhist or meditative chant. And I think the lyrics have this rhythm to them. And I think a cadence that reminds me of the Fireside Poets, like the old school, like Keatses and stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of rhythm to the lyrics themselves. I think elevating the rhythm, Bill Bruford is going nuts with the triplets on like the hi-hat and stuff. Chris and Steve are going nuts with their polyrhythms. And I think you have like 8 different rhythms going on all at once and then John Anderson. So I feel like this whole part just has a really rhythmic feel to it. And actually it's funny because the ending version of this, so at the very end of the song, they'll repeat this. And it's so huge. I forget how spare this first part is, where it really is actually just a few clean instruments. But in regards to the actual meaning of the lyrics, John Anderson actually weighed in on this. So a seasoned witch could call you from the depths of your disgrace, meaning that a higher self will eventually bring you out of your dark world. And it's like, actually, that's kind of what I was getting. Again, like a dog watching TV. I feel like that's the point of I feel like that's for me always been the point of this first part is like you're chanting, you're building up. It's kind of like an awakening because it's also punctuated with John Anderson going, ah, like it's actually punctuated with him like genuinely calling you from the depths of your disgrace. So there you go.
It's a very nice sentiment he comes up with there. And then he immediately launches into rearranging your liver to the solid mental grace. And that's when it turns into word salad again, because
So,
I defy anyone to tell me what that means.
so now we come to our friend Bill Bruford, who, when he heard the title of this part, Total Mass Retain, said, why not just call it Vomit? And at the time, I was like, Bill, you jerk. And then I was like, actually, I totally understand now why Bill was mad. And whilst I defend to my dying breath that these lyrics mean a lot to me, I think, I think Dark Side of the Moon, the lyrics mean a lot to other people as well. And so I understand why Bill Bruford would be like, what the heck?
If you took a few of these lyrics out in isolation or just got rid of the word love, call me crazy, but you could almost make this sound metal. I crucified my health and held the word within my hand sounds metal as shit.
Rock and roll. Yeah.
Yeah, as armored movers took approach to overlook the sea, that's like like Megadeth.
No, and I actually think, I actually think Yes is probably in a lot of modern metal, or way more than we'd ever think about. Like, I think modern metal enjoys musical complexity and rockin' lyrics.
Well, I mean, I think that's honestly a good comparison. I think Bron Daler from Mastodon is on record as saying how much he loved Yes and how much Bill Bruford's drumming got him going. That's seriously.
I mean, it's heavy. It's real heavy. And I think actually in regards to the lyrics as well, now that I think about it, we're talking about my four wonders of prog rock: Thick as a Brick, Dark Side of the Moon, Selling England by the Pound, Wish You Were Here in a Little Bit. They all have lyrics that mean a lot to me. And, I think this is almost self-evident as to why people like music. But it's funny, this actually hangs in with the others as much as any of the other, normal songs. And I was going to say, I'm going to spit on them again. It's not like the Beatles had the best lyrics in town. And I do think they actually have amazing lyrics, and I love their lyrics, and they mean a lot to me. But I think it's one of those things where I think Yes gets extra hate about their lyrics.
Well, I think when I say word salad, obviously that has a actual clinical meaning. But to me, if it was a salad, it's Jell-O salad. The multi-layer kind that's made in a bundt cake pan, and
okay, yep.
I think that hate is unfairly amplified by John's voice, right? It's very fairy, it's that high pitched, but correct me if I'm wrong, not technically falsetto, that makes this seem much more mystical and magical, which I love, but I think you could have a different vocalist do the same thing and it wouldn't be criticized as much.
Yeah.
Oh, you're right. And he's not a falsetto. That is a very high tenor that he jumps into.
And falsetto means false, and this is his speaking voice. He genuinely just talks like this.
True.
And including the word salad.
Which is interesting, too, because most of the time changes your voice differently. But if I'm not mistaken, he was also a heavy smoker.
Yeah, I don't know his smoking history. But yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. It might have roughened his voice, but it didn't lower it. So
it's funny, if you listen to Yes live, sometimes John will be like, "You ready for some rock and roll? Woo!" And it's just and I love Yes. As much as we joke about them, they are my favorite band. It's people in my personal life. Yeah. The more I make fun of you, I probably like you more. If I don't say anything critical to you, I probably don't really like you that much.
Yeah.
I love that because, yes, as easy it is to laugh at those moments. If you were there in that audience, you'd be losing your mind. You'd be like,
oh, yeah.
I am absolutely ready for this.
So the other thing about the lyrics, Steve Howe brought the lyric Close to the Edge about living by the river, the Thames River, which Steve lived on. Thames being the famous river of London. But John had just read Siddhartha, the famous book by Hermann Hesse. Basically, it's about the story of the Buddha. And as John said, the river leads you to the ocean. All paths lead you to the divine. So the idea was that as human beings, we are always close to the edge of realization. So that's what he's talking about when he says close to the edge. And then Steve was like, oh, he's fucking talking about the river. No, but we come to the close to the edge, down by the river, down by the edge, close by a river. The chorus, if you can call it that. And then John says, not right away, not right away. And this song is peppered with so many of these little moments like that I think keep the excitement going all the time. You know, I think if it had been, as you say, just one long jam, you know, the melody is really beautiful and you could have just done the Seasoned Witch verse over and over and over and that'd be fine. But I think they pepper it with all these little bits. Because, you know, at the beginning, John goes, ah, and then later we're going to have little bursts of keyboard here. We're going to have Chris changing the bass pattern there. And I think they add so many like little zesty bits. And, you know, it's what you were saying about the spices at the beginning, where there's all these flavors. You can't put your finger on it, but you're just happy that they were there. So we come to the verse, or the next part of the verse. Cross the line around the changes of the... My eyes convinced eclipse. That part. Yeah, no, so basically, we come to the next verse, which is verses 3 and 4. My eyes eclipsed, the moon erased the color to the sea and all that stuff. And it's funny, like they...
So we've gone from the solid time of change to total mass retain, I believe, is the start of this.
Yeah, I think we're now on... I think we're on total mass retain.
Yes.
We're on...
Yes.
Yeah, so they've... And basically, they just repeat the first two verses, but heavier. And again, I think that's the trick of this song, is that they're going to do this 3 times, and they just change the orchestration. And it's a trick they've used before with Yours Is No Disgrace and Heart of the Sunrise, where they just do the exact same thing. They just change the orchestration. And my God, it is an effective trick.
Yeah.
So I still don't know what he's talking about, but I feel like there's a great awakening happening. So it's the same thing where the chant part is kind of tense, and then that really relaxing part, you know, cross the line around the changes of the summer. And I think it alternates between those two of real tension and then kind of smooth, normal songness. So we come to the quiet part, and we're in the cave. And I don't know if I've brought up this theory yet on this podcast. I can't think of when I would have. But my cave theory about long songs, about the best long songs, you go into the cave for Act 3. And in Rush's 2112, which is the song that I originated this theory on, he literally goes into a cave. but this song, I feel like it actually, he's going into a cave to meditate or whatever. But I actually feel like they sonically work with the cave thing. They hadn't heard my theory yet, being like 50 years ago. They didn't know my theory was to come, but they have kind of like it's very reverby, very hazy. You can see like the drips of the stalactites and stuff. So this is the cave part of the song. And I feel like this is where in every song you sit down and you hear some hard truths about your life and you meditate a little bit.
Well, we're sort of into the third theme. I mean, starting with close to the edge, down by the river, seasons will pass you by, and then what I would call my Saturdays, which are I usually get up really early, not sleeping well because I sleep terribly. I go on a long, like 15 to 20K run. I get a cup of coffee, and then I get on my couch. And for the next 2 hours, I sometimes get up to like change the laundry, and I get back down. I get up to maybe get a cup of coffee, and I get back down. So that's usually what I do over Saturdays, is just those things. And just like the song, I just repeat it.
And just like the song, the organ in the background of your apartment is blasting as you get up and get down.
Yes.
Because, I mean, this is some operatic organ that gets going in this part of the song. It is.
So we've left the quiet part where he does the In Her White Lace, blah, 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 blah. Just one real quick part about that. I love that they do the broken echo thing where John sings something and Steve and Chris sing something completely different back. It's just one of my favorite songwriting tricks. But yes, then we come to the organ.
Well, them singing different parts, that's Brian's downstairs neighbor banging on the ceiling with a broomstick, telling him to keep it down, and he's yelling back at them. The image is complete.
Yeah, so we come to the organ solo. So this was recorded in St. Giles without Cripplegate in London.
Which sounds like a fake name for a place in England that you would make up. But
Yep. I feel like that's like
it's
90% of London's names where you're like, you're joking, right? And they're like, no, 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 no.
Oh wait, St. Giles with cripple or without cripple? Because they're very no.
So this is the same organ that Rick Wakeman would use for his Six Wives of Henry VIII album, An Old Friend. And yeah, it's just a perfect build to an epic ending. A perfect organ swell, trading off into the Moog solo. So I feel like we have old and new together in one man's furious fingers.
Yeah.
So interestingly about this, I guess we'll come to Rick Wakeman's contribution to Yes here. So we talked about it in Fragile about how he brought a lot of like fun and sonic textures, but I don't feel like he ever overshone the other guys. And it's actually really interesting. I feel like he leaves so much space for them besides being like the greatest keyboardist of all time. But yeah, I always wonder how much he did in the background, because obviously he knows a ridiculous amount about music. I always wonder how much he did in the background to help them like musically weave the songs together. Because like when he leaves, I feel like that's when things become jazz fusion-y.
Maybe he is the Ringo that Brian is looking for.
He's the mythical Ringo. Oh my God, you rearrange Rick Wakeman. And it becomes Rinka.
It's an
Rinka
anagram.
The mythical Ringo. But yeah, no, because he spiritually checks out for Tales from Topographic Oceans, the next one, and that's a bloated mess. So actually, I wonder how much he really did provide for them as an arranger and editor. But here we go to the final epic ending. And this is where I feel like you've learned everything you need to know about life, and you're looking out over the vista, the valley, the silence of the valley, and you get up and you get down. The end.
so goddamn good.
Yeah, I
wish I had something more profound to say.
don't know what else to say other than you're. It's like that. No, that's not appropriate for this podcast.
So Ryan's referring to when you've finished the last part of a frappuccino and you're sucking on the straw and just that last little slurp.
I don't know.
You get up and then you get back down.
Yeah. So there you have it. That was close to. What's an appropriate way to end the song, Brian? Think of something godly.
Well, I'm going to get into my one suggestion for the album to as I start to reveal my tiny criticisms.
His masterworks. Yeah.
Do tell.
I think they should have swapped the order of the album. I think this should have been the end.
Oh, I have written that exact same note on Siberian Katru.
Wait, so Brian, the album goes in reverse. Siberian Katru is track 1
first.
Yeah, exactly the opposite order. Exactly right. Because how do you come back from this?
So for those at home, Ryan's eyes are literally bugging out of his head.
I've never thought about that.
Imagine seeing this live, and then this is what happened, and you'd be like, "Time to leave." You're only 18 minutes of the concert. It's like, how could you come back from this?
But then actually, so that was my original thought, and I completely agree with you. I definitely have thought this thought. But then I was thinking, so to take Ryan's analogy forward, so you've just finished drinking a delicious frappuccino, and you're in the happy glow of, you've sucked some of the whipped cream out of the top. And then it's like, actually, you kind of want a fun snack afterwards, and that's what Siberian Katru gives you.
The little chocolate in the whipped cream is what you're saying?
The little chocolate in the whipped cream. I think that's what... No, because I was like, I actually feel like, imagine if it's just like you started with the fun stuff, then you go to And You and I, and then you just have this heavy experience, and then you have to face your life again. Actually, maybe you want a fun walkout. So, there you go. But I take your point. I actually think it would be a more sensible album structure. So with that, we are going to take a break for this week, and we will catch up with you in a few days' time for the second half of Close to the Edge. I want to thank Brian and Ryan. And we will see you.
Thank you, Ian.
Anyways, and we will see you next week for the second half of Close to the Edge.